Good evening.
Good evening.
Well, it is a bit chilly out there. It's amazing how yesterday we could be high 70s, looking at 80s, and today below freezing. But nevertheless, I guess that is Oklahoma. But it is good to see each of you here, those who are able to brave the cold, the weather, and be able to come together and worship today. What a good thing, what a blessing it is to see each of you once again. What an encouragement. That is, each and every moment we have these opportunities to gather together. As you guys know, we are looking at, and we have been examining here on Sunday nights, the minor prophets, majoring, if you will, as the theme has been suggested and said, majoring in the minor prophets. And today we begin by looking at another one of those prophets, called minor only because of the length of its book, and that is the prophet of Haggai. And today we will look at those introductory remarks, those introductory information that help us and bolster us in our study of Haggai, that help us grasp the concept, the understanding why Haggai wrote what he wrote, why God had him write these things, and why on top of that it is there for us to study Romans 15 verse 4. Those things of latter times, in other words, those things of the Old Testament are written for our learning, aren't they? And God had these things inspired, written down for us to learn from. And so that brings us to the introduction to Haggai. The matter, those information, as you know, we usually go through beginning with our first point. And if you have your handout, the historical background information, that information that is vital, that is necessary for us to grasp and understand those contextual things that help us get a better understanding of Haggai and his message. To begin with, though, we're going to look at the author himself. Now, when we look at the prophet Haggai, when we look at this particular man, we see that there is not much concerning him. We don't have information about his hometown, as we have found from time to time of other prophets. We don't learn of his occupation like we did of Amos. We don't learn of his family as we do with others. But what we do learn and what we do find is found here in the book of Haggai, and also what we find there in Ezra, as we'll notice here in a moment. Now, considering the time he is preaching, we know concerning Haggai that he was with the first group to come out of the Babylonian bondage, to come out of that slavery. Of course, at this time, it was under the Persian bondage, as the Medo-Persians, Cyrus, remember, had been able to conform the Medes and the Persians, brought them together as one empire, and overthrew, with God's help, with his providence, the great kingdom of Babylon. And so when that first group under Zerubbabel, Ezra chapter 2, migrated with permission back down to Jerusalem, back down and over to their home place, the place where they were born, the place where they had, some of them had been born and others heard about, that they longed to. Remember Daniel chapter 9, Daniel longing, having been in captivity under the first group to be taken by Babylon, knowing those 70 years of captivity, as God has promised, were coming to the end. In Daniel 9, we see the longing that was there. Well, we see these people come back, the remnant come back. And what we see from and what we find in Ezra chapter 2 is that Haggai must have been a part of that first group. Now, there were three different groups that came. Zerubbabel, then Ezra led a group, and then what we find is, of course, Nehemiah, the last one to lead some people to Jerusalem. And so when we look at this, we find that this is important, that this is the group that Haggai is with. Some have also suggested, because of Haggai chapter 2 and verse 3, that he could have actually been alive, a young boy, but been alive when the destruction of Jerusalem took forth, or happened under Nebuchadnezzar. In Haggai chapter 2 and verse 3 it says, "Who was left among you who saw this house in its former glory? How do you see it now? Is it not as nothing in your eyes?" As Haggai proclaims this, there were obviously some who had seen the temple in its former glory. And Haggai could be one of those, as he reflects. It's kind of given as one of those rhetorical questions, as maybe he's part of that group. It doesn't necessarily say that, but some have suggested it could be the case. And if that is the case, then Haggai would have roughly been around 80 years old or so when he came back. And so imagine that, if you will. If he was this prophesying at this time, at this age, and the things he's really going to have to say to the people about their lack of doing what God would have them to do. And so when we look at this and we see this, there's really, as I mentioned, not that much information. We have the book of Haggai, which is 2 chapters, 2 small chapters, at best you could say. We also have him mentioned in Ezra chapter 5, 1 and 2, and also Ezra chapter 6, 14 through 16, where the book of Ezra remarks about the prophet Haggai and the work he was doing, him and Zerubbabel, as we'll talk about in a few weeks. Zechariah, as we talk about in a few weeks. And so when we look at this, we see that Haggai is the author of the book. And he is a prophet who has a great responsibility to follow the will of God, though we don't have much information on him. And what we do, we find in this book in Ezra 5 and 6. Now, concerning the date, we've seen that it's been kind of interesting to some degree. You take a lot of outside sources and then the internal sources to try to get somewhat close to the dating. However, when it comes to the book of Haggai, even though it's so small, it gives us a ton of information concerning the date. In fact, I would venture to say that Haggai is probably one of the most easiest books to date because of the information he gives us. In Haggai chapter 1 and verse 2, he says, "In the 2nd year of Darius the king, in the 6th month, on the 1st day of the month, the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai to the prophet, to Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua the son of Jehozadak, the high priest." And so we see here very clearly we have an exact date. We have exact information giving us the time frame for which Haggai is dealing with, the time frame he is talking about, the context that's going on. He gives us that information more than once in this short book. Now, Darius the king here is Darius the Great, also known as Darius the First or Darius the Haspius. And it should not be confused. He shouldn't be confused with the Darius of Mede, who threw Daniel in the lion's den. This is not the same Darius here. No, this is Darius the Great, who seized the Persian Empire after Cyrus died, and his son Cambyses had a somewhat weak rule following that. And so Darius the Great really took over from that point and became and unified the empire once again, and he ruled from 522 to 486 BC. We know not only from the Word of God about this Darius, but also from the secular information that is out there. And so when it comes to the book of Haggai, that puts him, or at least what he's writing about, at 520 BC. We can be that exact or that precise when it comes to the year. 520 BC is when Haggai was written. All that information is good and is necessary and helpful when it comes to understanding the context, isn't it? And that's the most important thing, the background information that really bolsters why Haggai is preaching and prophesying what he's prophesying. Why God picked him to go through and preach this message of temple building, of correction of what had been done wrong. And so when the context looks, let's go ahead and look at the things that took place leading up to 520 BC, where God would send Haggai to discuss these problems that are going on. In 562 BC, Nebuchadnezzar dies, and this is important because remember, he is the golden head in the dream he had there in Daniel chapter 2. He is the great gold empire, if you will. But when he dies, there starts to become a shift. The empire of Babylon begins to decline. It begins to crumble to where in 549 BC, Cyrus unites the Medes and Persians, seeing Babylon's decline. seeing them being weakened. And in 539, Cyrus seizes control of Babylon and starts allowing captives. And this is key. As Cyrus would overthrow the different places, as he would overcome different people, he would allow those who had been captives under Babylonian rule, under the Babylonian thumb, he would allow those captives to start going home. Because remember, under the Assyrians and under the Babylonians, as they would conquer, then they would take the people and disperse them throughout their empire, from city to city, so they couldn't really stay together. But Cyrus wasn't like that. In fact, he's unique really in history when it comes to this in many ways, especially at this time. Historians baffle at why this one out of all the others, especially when you look at the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire, what led Cyrus to this? Of course, we know, as Isaiah prophesied, that God was leading this group, this empire up. He was building it up to do his will. And so when we look at this, we examine this, this led to 538, 1 year later. That first remnant gets to start going home. That first, gets the good news that Cyrus has said, listen, those of Israel, the Hebrew people, the Jews, he creates an edict saying that they can return home. Now, it's a few years of preparation for them to return, as Cyrus helps them in this and gives them many of the things they need to make the travel. And so in 536 BC, Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest lead the first group of people back to Jerusalem. And what happens, we read in the book of Ezra in particular, it gives us that information, is they begin to work on the temple. That's their goal. They want to get back and create and establish once again the temple of God, the house of God, where God could then dwell in Jerusalem, his home, Mount Zion, once again. And so they begin very diligently making that work. But the Samaritans, those who, as Babylon came and destroyed Jerusalem, many of those that were left that didn't head down to Egypt, and those who forced Jeremiah to go with them, those who stayed in the area that weren't taken off into captivity, they mingled amongst the Gentiles and had intermarried, and this is where we get that group called the Samaritans. And this is the reason, in fact, this remnant and Haggai, is the reason the Jews cannot and could not stand the Samaritans, because as they saw their relatives come back, this remnant come back, and start working on the temple, they wanted to help. They came and said, let us help. Now, they had some ulterior motives, the scriptures teach. They had some things behind their arms, almost can we help with the fingers crossed kind of situation. And when the Jews rejected it, when the Israelites said, listen, we can't do this because God has told us not to intermarry. In fact, in Ezra chapter 10, he forced all the wives and children that had been married, that had married the Israelites who were not Jews, who were Gentiles, to go back to where they came from. God had warned them before not to marry outside the faith. And so as this took place and as the Samaritans came up, the Jews said, no, listen, we don't want to get in the same situation we're in. We'll take care of this. And this upset the Samaritans and they hindered the work. Ezra chapter 3 and verse 4, we read. And it stifled the work of the temple because as they were working, they were worried about what was coming at them, that maybe these people would cause a problem. They were worried about, well, what kind of issues will they attack? What kind of things will they do? And in fact, later on, the Samaritans were actually able to get the Persian emperor, the king Artaxerxes, to stop by commandment the building of the temple. And so the Jews, as they came back, commanded by God, establish my house, build my home. That work was being thwarted, not only by the king, but the Samaritans and other officials in the area. And for 16 years, the only thing of the temple that was being built, or the only thing built of the temple, was the foundation. That was it. They had a foundation. They had what was necessary to erect God's house, but for 16 years it didn't happen. And you can almost see and understand, listen, they're dealing with opposition, they're dealing with things. The king himself has said, listen, hold off for a while till we get this thing figured out. Stop. I see these Jews have been formidable people in the past. We don't want that to take place. And so there was one thing after another, even though God had commanded it, just one thing after another was happening. And you can imagine the people's thoughts. Well, we'll get to it at some point. And in the meantime, they had built their homes, not the wall. Nehemiah was the one who helped get the wall built to protect them. But in the meantime, they had built their homes. They had built their houses. And their houses had become nice. Their house had been something that was good to look at. And this is where Haggai comes in. It's this reason that God sends Haggai. He gives them and patiently waits 16 years for them to fulfill what they said they would do, to fulfill His law, to keep His commandments concerning the rebuilding of the temple. For 16 years, God patiently waited, and now was the time to get going. Haggai is sent, and that's what Haggai is about. Why have the people not rebuilt the temple? Why have they hindered or stopped doing what God would have them to do? And that brings us to the outline as we look at it, as we examine it. This is what Haggai is dealing with, a proclamation, a prophecy, if you will, to the people. Stop being indifferent. In fact, that's really going to be the first chapter. Is all about the people are being rebuked for indifference. They were indifferent towards the temple. They knew what they were supposed to do, which is evident by their reaction to Haggai's message. But nevertheless, they found themselves being indifferent. God going so far in Haggai chapter 1 and verse 9 to say, you looked for much, and behold, it came to little. And when you brought it home, I blew it away. Why? Why was it you toiled and labored and things weren't working out? Why, declares the Lord of hosts, because of my house that lies in ruins. While each of you busies himself with his own house. In verse 4, he would say, you live in paneled homes, but my house is in ruins. The people have become indifferent. They had found themselves having really forgotten in some ways, or become used to just seeing the slab of foundation of God's house. And God says, wake up to this reality. He then would go in chapter 2, verses 1 through 9, where he goes and encourages the workers and encourages a work. He rebukes them for their indifference, and then he says, listen, you need to be about the business of correcting this. And the people, to their credit, they did begin to build the temple. They did begin to work on the temple. In Haggai chapter 2 and verse 4 it says, yet now be strong, O Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, O Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord. Work, for I am with you, declares the Lord of hosts. Remember their fears. Their fears were real. The king had caused issues with this. The Samaritans, who were real close, had caused issues. God says, work, for I am with you. Get back to doing the business at hand, what you have been asked to do, that I may dwell in your presence. As we continue looking at the outline, we see in chapter 2, 10 through 14, we see the defilement of the people is recognized. God starts talking about and brings up the fact that the people were defiled. They were unclean. They weren't doing and building the temple as they should, as righteous, holy, and upright, having purified themselves as they should. In Haggai chapter 2 and verse 14 it says, then Haggai answered and said, so is it with this people, having talked about those things that make people unclean, and with this nation before me, declares the Lord, and so with every work of their hands, and what they offer there is unclean. They had been implored to work, but they hadn't cleansed themselves. They hadn't made themselves holy to work on the temple. What a powerful message and thought, reality, when we think about what is being said there. And lastly, we see in chapter 2, 15 through 23, the end of the book there, we see that the blessings that are promised for the obedient. God has always promised the blessings that come with Him and His spiritual blessings to those who are righteous, true, and upright. In Haggai chapter 2 and verse 19 it says, "Is the seed yet in the barn? Indeed, the vine, the fig tree, the pomegranate, and the olive tree have yielded nothing, but from this day I will bless you." Why? Because they had cleansed themselves and they got about the business of working. They got about the business of doing what God wanted them to do. Stop being worried and stop worrying about the dangers of this world. God says, listen, those things you don't have to worry about. I am with you. I will bless you. Next week, as we get into the book of Haggai, as we look at the message, there's several powerful lessons within it. As we think of the importance of putting first things first, as we think of the importance of recognizing that though this world is challenging, difficult, and sometimes tries to get us to not follow God and His Word. Satan's good at what he does, isn't he? He's good at manipulating and challenging and making us indifferent without even knowing it. I have no doubt that the Israelites, they didn't realize they were indifferent to the house of the Lord. They didn't realize that they had let it go by while they were doing other things. They thought, well, listen, the king and the Samaritans, all these people have caused problems. They're keeping us from doing it. And God says, no. The world cannot keep you from doing what is right. Follow me, live up to me. As we look at Haggai, I pray that this week you read it. You study, you examine it. It's a powerful, powerful book. It's short. Chapter 1, 1 through 15, 2, 1 through 23, there's not much to it as far as length goes. But the message is powerful. And we'll examine that next week. As you consider your life and as you think of your life, is there anything that has been going on? As you constantly try to prove all things, and that includes your walk with God, are you walking in a way worthy of Him? Or have you allowed the world to overcome or make you indifferent? Like I said, it's easy to do. It's easy to find ourselves putting other things ahead of God without even realizing it. Maybe there's someone here who's been struggling with that and they would like our help. The church's help to encourage and strengthen and help you in this. If that's the case, we implore you to allow us to do that. It would be our honor to be able to serve you. It would be our honor to pray for you, encourage you, and strengthen you. If there is someone here tonight who needs the prayers of this congregation, let us know. Let us help you. Let us be there for you as we stand and as we sing.